Hi there, my name is Leslie Schwalm. I am Professor Emeritus of History and Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Iowa.
Well, thank you for participating. And today we're going to be talking about your most recent book, I suppose, called Medicine, Science, and Making Race in Civil War America. And I'd love for you to begin by telling us how you came to uncover this topic and what you found while investigating it.
Well, there's two parts to that story. One is when I was working on my previous book about emancipation and Reconstruction in the Upper Midwest. I was doing a lot of research on Iowa's Black Regiment, and in doing that research, I came across some pretty awful information about the medical mistreatment of Black soldiers. So that kind of pinged for me that there was likely a bigger story there. But if we go back a lot further, when I was in graduate school, I was very lucky to work with Professor Vanessa Northington Gamble, who is just a brilliant scholar in the history of medicine and race. And that work sort of helped me understand what I was looking at many years later about this medical mistreatment. So that kind of started it for me. Honestly, I did not know what I was going to find when I started the research for this book.
Well, one of the things I found so fascinating about what you did find was we're talking mainly north here. And
Oh,
this
yes.
is a northern story of how medicine was racialized. And, I know there's been a lot of work being done about the slave community and how that was exploited for medical gain. But let's talk about how the North did similar things with a different group of people. So I suppose let's start with the Black conscripted Civil War veterans and those who were the Black regiments.
Right. Well, for these men, as we have understood for a long time, they entered into a military that was rigidly segregated, but also profoundly racist. So it wasn't just in the way it was organized, but also it was in how soldiers were treated. Now, of course, there were, some white commanders and white officers in the military structure who were not only abolitionists, but also anti-racist. But it's also true there were a great many commanders who really regarded Black soldiers as subhuman and treated them that way. And, of course, decided to try to do a little investigation on their own and gain some authority as experts on race science and race medicine by conducting their own investigations into what they thought was the embodiment of Black inferiority.
And one of the most striking statistics you have in the book is that of the 37,000 Black troops that died during the Civil War, 30,000 of them died in hospitals and camps due to sickness, maltreatment, and disease. So in that context, let's talk about this group that was formed, the U.S. Sanitary Commission, and just what they were trying to do, not only for Civil War or the Northern Army, but also for these African Americans who were enlisted.
Right. So the Sanitary Commission is organized years before Black enlistment, and their primary goal was to try to improve the Army's sort of medical establishment. So that includes things like to provide plans for good hospitals and to try to ensure that medical officers were well trained and well informed. So a big part of what the Sanitary Commission did was to publish and circulate medical treatises to help physicians who had to encounter, of course, the unimaginable, not only on the battlefield, but in camps where men, and not just African American men, it's true for white soldiers as well, were dying largely of disease. So the Sanitary Commission sort of stepped into that. Now, it had, a bit of a complicated origin story where originally it was came from the idea of a female physician, Elizabeth Blackwell, who saw an opportunity for white women to organize to provide the kind of relief that the Army was not prepared to offer, whether it's a uniform or a bandage or preserving food to forward to the Army. But when Elizabeth Blackwell asked some elite men to represent that idea to the Secretary of War, those men decided they had a better idea, and they basically took over the Sanitary Commission and shaped it according to their ideas under male leadership, which is so ironic because the Sanitary Commission wouldn't have existed without tens of thousands of women organized into these relief societies that made things and sewed things and raised money and did everything they could from the home front, the northern home front, to support the Army. Again, the United States was not prepared for war on this scale. So, I mean, the fundraising and the provisions that they offered were really essential to the well-being of the Union Army. What the men wanted to do, however, was to become recognized as men of mark. That's the language they used, and they thought a key part of that would be their medical and scientific research that they did during the course of the war. And in fact, some of the male officials of the commission were a little upset that the women were getting the attention in terms of providing relief when what they wanted the commission to be known for was scientific research. And that's a part of the commission that I think that part of the history has not been well told up until now. And that's not to fault any historians out there, but rather the documents, the immense archive of documents has only recently been reorganized and the finding aid rewritten in order to allow us access into what is a profoundly huge archive about the work of the commission.
And I do want to talk about the commission's work in defining race and kind of taking over Black bodies once again at this moment of, there are all these pivot points in history, and it seems like this was one of them. And I think that because this became such a large bureaucratic endeavor, it also, as much as it included people, it also really sought to actively exclude, especially the African American population, the freedmen of the North, the freed people of the North, who were themselves advocating for aid and comfort to the Union Army, especially to the enlisted African Americans.
Right, right. And this is, I think, one of the contributions of the work I've done is to document very clearly that white women and white men understood their work to be the privilege of whiteness, and the honor or the respect or the authority that they gained, they did not want to share with African Americans. And so Black men and women in the North were organizing their own soldiers' aid societies, especially after Black men were allowed into the Army. But even before that, Black men and women were organizing to support the Union Army because, of course, they believed this war would end slavery, and they were very much in support of that. But it's really quite remarkable how rigidly the white women of the Sanitary Commission maintained a race line and made the Sanitary Commission really an inherently white organization. Uh, and I will note that there were three Black women's organizations that were admitted officially as part of the Sanitary Commission. And two of them were organized among some of the nation's most elite Black women from very wealthy families in Philadelphia. I don't know why those three were admitted, but those women's names, the officers of the Black Women's Organization, were never listed in the official Sanitary Commission record. So they were admitted, but they were kept kind of to the sidelines.
Yeah, and we'll get to kind of how this whole project starts to create race in a post-emancipation landscape, not only for the South, but also for the North. And I think that this is a piece of that puzzle that we just talked about. Can you speak a little bit about Frederick Law Olmsted's role in all of this? Because he's such an oversized character in this period of history. And I was surprised to find him once again popping up in this story.
Yeah, he's very interesting to study. His trail into and out of the Sanitary Commission was really quite remarkable to follow. For our listeners who maybe not be familiar with his long history, before the war, he designed and oversaw, supervised the construction of Central Park, a project that involved him in employing and supervising hundreds and thousands of mostly immigrant white men. And in the course of that work, he decided to undertake a project to measure the physique of these immigrant men. And when the war started, his work on that project stopped, and he connected with the director of the Smithsonian Institution, who was interested in a project that would measure man, in essence, come up with some sense of, what are the variations among humanity and et cetera. And eventually, Sanitary Commission becomes a sort of location of that project under Frederick Law Olmsted. So he'd already had this experience. He had a form. He had an idea about, what kind of equipment would be needed to conduct a project like this. And so, again, this is before the enlistment of Black soldiers. There was a really quite a large project to undertake the measurement of the bodies of white soldiers. And this is the first instance where civilians and military officials realize that soldiers are a captive audience, that they can be used in research. And so the Sanitary Commission sends out agents to measure these white soldiers, and they measure thousands of them. They go to the encampments, they have portable equipment, they train agents, and they do these measurements. What changes is when the Army decides to allow Black men to enlist, and they begin drafting Black men. And at that point, the Sanitary Commission hires a new supervisor of this work. Olmsted has left the organization, and the person they hire, the nation's most prominent astronomer, is very surprised that there's been no work to measure the now newly enlisted Black men. And he turns the focus of that project onto measuring the bodies of Black men, and hires, a new round of investigators, comes up with a new form because he believed that if you're going to measure Black men's bodies, you have to measure different things. So he enters into this project believing that Blackness is embodied in very specific anatomical ways. And so he directs the agents to measure particular things like the girth of the neck and the distance between the nipples and the distance of the arch of the foot and other things. And along with those measurements, there was also kind of a social questionnaire that went along with it. So the commission ended up working very hard to measure Black soldiers before they were mustered out at the end of the war. There was really kind of a frenzy to get to the Black regiments. The Sanitary Commission didn't always know when regiments were moving, when their camps were moving, and they were very committed to getting as many of those measurements as possible. And so the result is almost 16,000 forms of measurements of white soldiers, Black soldiers, and about 2,000 measurements of American Indian soldiers. There was also a lot of racial interest in the embodiment of Native America.
Well, and I think maybe we should talk a little bit about why they were so interested in these measurements to begin with, and just the idea of, the different races being different classes or species of human, and how some of these, what we consider today deeply, deeply racist, problematic, and frankly crazy ideas of skull shape and bumps and ridges, how all this, what they were actually trying to do and how they justified it.
So these white elites, these medical officers, these civilians, these agents who were doing the measuring, they inherited a centuries-old idea about race that people of African descent and people of European descent descended from different origins and were inherently unequal. And that difference, that inferiority and superiority could be measured. And this was, connected to the rise of scientific thinking and the rise of numbers as facts, as something that could be observed and measured and analyzed. So these people didn't invent these ideas, they inherited them. And I believe you've done a previous interview with Christopher Willoughby, who published a great book about the Northern physicians who were trained in race science, how common this was in Northern medical schools. For these physicians to write their thesis about race science. It was, so this was a way of thinking that was inherited by this generation of medical and scientific professionals or amateurs. And so they saw in the collection of soldiers, right, gathered for this war, for this new modern war on a scale unprecedented, they saw the opportunity to prove what they already believed, right? And so that is what they set out to do. They set out to prove what they already believed. And to the point, and I find this very interesting, that the director of the Sanitary Commission project, Benjamin Gould, believed that the facts were self-evident in the measurement. So he felt like he didn't need to go into any great lengths doing comparative analyses. He said it's there. The ethnographic proof is there of Black inferiority, and I will leave it to other people to work with this data. And people did work with the data for a long time, including such notable people as Frederick Hoffman, who came up with the actuarial table that argued that the lifespan of African Americans had to be shorter because they were so physically inferior, weak, etc., susceptible to disease, again, by nature of their Blackness. So this is a project that really drew on and expanded an existing idea about race as a biological entity that produced naturally Black inferiority and, of course, then white superiority. So this was all part of that project. And I think, you know, we often, historians often ask ourselves, why is it that anti-Black racism persists after the destruction of slavery? We've long understood that ideas about race in the United States were deeply shaped by necessity by the practice of Black slavery, that you can't enslave and sell and buy and torture and mistreat a people unless you construct a belief that they are somehow not human. We've known that for a long time, but then the question is, well, if we destroy slavery, then shouldn't that anti-Black racism no longer have a function in American society? And what we see through the Civil War and the action of Northern whites is that indeed Northern society was structured around ideas about race difference, and those beliefs were a central part of identity for many Northern whites. So really what the Civil War reveals is how critical ideas about race were to the nation, to the national project, and not just to the slaveholding South.
Right. And I think, your work is incredibly important for really driving that nail all the way down, because it shows how these projects that didn't start out racialized, when they started to include African Americans, became so fundamentally racist and brought into that narrative that we would think would have an opportunity to disappear. And as part of that, we've talked about how we've measured the physical bodies. They also had a great opportunity, that being the commission at this point in the Civil War, to send out these questionnaires to field doctors and physicians and people who were working with the population of soldiers during the war. And I'd love for you to tell us what those questionnaires were and just what they accomplished.
Right. So let me do a little bit of a background to that. Before the Civil War, this notion of a social survey was gaining a lot of sort of scientific credence. And the U.S. government, a big part of our budget was put in towards scientific research and investigation, and there was a lot invested in publishing reports based on surveys and questionnaires. So it was a form of inquiry that was gaining authority. And sure enough, very early in the war, as soon as Black men are being employed as laborers as well as enlisted, white officers saw an opportunity to do research, not only because they were curious, but because if one conducted research, did surveys, wrote it up, then one was recognized as a professional authority, that you gained kind of the authority of a scientist, of a published author. So the first survey that I could find, I don't necessarily think it's the first one, but the first one I could find was done by an engineer in South Carolina, an officer who commanded and employed Black men to build fortifications and entrenchments in South Carolina. And he devised a survey that he circulated to just a handful of other engineering officers who also employed Black men and had enlisted Black men under them. And he basically was asking them, how do you see race manifesting itself in these Black men? Do you see it in this way? Do you see it in that way? And of course, the other officers were eager to participate in this scientific research. And so they responded, with their various ideas about how race appeared in the bodies and the behavior and the intelligence of Black men. And again, they're just sort of repeating things that they believed even before the war, right? So they believed black men were more like untrained animals than white men. They believed that black men were more subservient, so they might be better soldiers. They believed black men were less intelligent, so that they might not be as smart at figuring things out, but they could be given orders and they could be put to doing hard work, which is what the men under engineering officers did, and save the lives of white men because black men would do the hard, dirty, difficult, dangerous labor. So that's the first survey, the earliest survey I could find. But there were several that were done during the course of the war, and they grew in size. They grew in terms of how many were circulated and in their impact, because after the war, people would write based on these surveys and again make the argument that people of African descent were clearly biologically inferior because look, all these white officers, medical officers, commanders respond to these surveys, arguing that yes, blackness is an embodied inferiority. It's really quite amazing to read through these surveys. One of the most interesting surveys I found was conducted by the provost marshal's office after the war. After the war's over, he writes to enlisting officers all across the North, and he says, he asks all kinds of questions, but one of those questions was, "What do you think about enlisting black men in the military service?" And most of the enlisting officers wrote back. Of course, almost all of them were white. And they would say, well, I didn't enlist many black soldiers. I didn't encounter many, but I have a lot of ideas about race and about blackness compared to whiteness. And these responses were again just this catalog of inherited ideas that white officers felt entitled to report as facts. As facts. And that's how these surveys were treated, as reports of factual information. And that's, of course, the problem. These are just reports of beliefs, not of facts. And so that was published as a part of, really the United States research on the war. And what we should understand about the war is this one question about black soldiers that was really just about white beliefs about race. That's how it should have been framed. That is what it reported.
Right. And then when you couple it with the kind of the junk data that they collected on the other side, which is like all this measurements of things that are random on the human body.
Right.
The data is coming together with this narrative to recode all that, well, as you put it in the book, to solve, explain, and investigate the problem of post-emancipation race.
Right. So how do we sustain our society, which is based on white privilege and black exclusion? How do we sustain that in the aftermath of a war that we have fought that ultimately ended slavery? And so this data, numerical, observational, social questionnaires, all serve that purpose to argue that, yes, we need to sustain this organization of society because we must sustain white superiority and black inferiority. It is a fact of nature. So we are okay to maintain laws and practices that exclude or dominate black people.
And I would just like to make one note because I think it's really important to include moments of black resistance and pushback. We did it with the commission. And I think you do it again in the book here, where there were moments of white commanding officers and doctors who said this is ridiculous. But on the other hand, there was a lot more pushback from the Black enlisted men. So we just
It's true. That's very true. I'm glad you brought it up because it was, moments of surprise for me in the archive to find the occasional white officer or medical officer saying, this is nonsense. This is not what's actually happening. This is not true. I mean, that was great. It was also, of course, fascinating to read about Black soldiers who refused to be measured, who were suspicious about the endeavor, who had questions about why they were being measured, who would go into the measuring agent's tent at night and destroy the records because they believed that this was up to no good. And felt they weren't able to give permission because they were soldiers being ordered by the superior officers to undergo these measurements. So
yeah, and I think we're now going to move into some of the more ghoulish and really disturbing aspects of what happens next. As far as we have obviously a standing army that is out in the field and is fighting and getting sick, and those people are living. But then there was this whole new population of dead Americans who served as fodder for this emerging medical community. And if you would talk a little bit about how, especially Black cadavers and wounded, not so much wounded, but dead bodies of fallen soldiers were abused and just completely desecrated.
So, very early in the war, the Army decided that one of the things it could do during this war was to document the medical side of our nation's first modern war, the first war where we have rifles, where we have the devastating impact of major artillery and cannons, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a decision to create a medical museum archive that would document the impact of modern warfare. And so an order was sent out to medical officers saying, we need to receive from you medical specimens of the damage that modern warfare does on the bodies of soldiers so that we can learn, right, how to treat soldiers, how to surgically intervene, how to treat disease, et cetera. So the order was take body parts that are amputated, take internal organs that are the result of post-mortem exams, label them with wooden tags, put them in barrels of whiskey, and we will pay for the expense of shipping those back to us, where we will turn them into medical specimens. And they also asked for accompanying written reports, case reports about the soldier whose body parts were being forwarded. And then they were turned into specimens by anatomical experts at the medical museum, the Army Medical Museum, and turned into specimens, and they were displayed. Initially at Ford's Theater was the location of the first incarnation of the museum. So, physicians took this very seriously. The medical officers, they took it seriously because they were being entrusted to aid the nation in its medical advances during warfare. And also, they knew that as so-called donors, their names would be attached to these specimens as well. And so they would gain that kind of authority as someone who offered up something to this effort to gain new knowledge and produce new knowledge. So that's all well and good. But one of the things that becomes interesting about this is this project continues the investment of American scientists in collecting crania, that is, skulls. Now, this is a project that dates back to the 18th century. The belief that, number one, the skulls of people of so-called different races were of different sizes because the superior races, it was believed, had larger brains, and larger brains meant higher intelligence, which we now know is not absolutely not true. But there was a great interest in collecting skulls of different people across the world and measuring the skull case to argue, stuff about brain size and its connection to race. So this continues during the war. And so skulls of not just soldiers, but of enslaved people and cadavers, of course, fresh and not fresh cadavers were forwarded to the Army Medical Museum. And indeed, they said quite clearly, we wish to have uh, among the best collections of crania in the United States. They wanted to compete with the person who at that time had the best collection, the race scientist Samuel Morton. And as it turns out, some of the people preparing the specimens at the Army Medical Museum had worked with Samuel Morton in putting together his crania collection. So there really is this incredible through line of race science during and after the war that really pulls on what was happening before the war. So I do want to point out that one of the really interesting things that turns up in looking at all these specimens that were cataloged, they had to be cataloged, and then enormous volumes produced that illustrated these specimens with the attached case reports, is that we see the Army medical establishment using Black bodies as examples of humanity, not as examples of Black physical inferiority, but rather as simply unmarked humans. So what becomes interesting is that when Black cadavers or injured Black soldiers were operated on and specimens taken, they were sometimes used as simply an example of a surgical procedure or of a disease and how it affects the colon or the heart. And other times, Black bodies are used as examples of Black inferiority in embodied race. And that illogic is sustained. It's, very clear in the published material and not at all apparent to the people who were manifesting it.
Right. And sometimes that could just be due to clerical error, because one of the things you uncover in the book is just how poorly the fallen soldiers and the graveyards that were people were interned in after a battle, where the record keeping was notoriously awful. And there were people who just disappeared because you never knew what happened to them. There was no record where they found what happened.
Well, I want to be clear about this. I want to say a little bit more about that, the disappearance of deceased soldiers. Again, most Black soldiers died in hospitals and camps, places where they were known, where their name was known, where there were comrades, where their supervising officer was there. Their names were known, and yet they are buried without that information, unlike white soldiers. And this is, again, perhaps a less direct example of medical and scientific racism, but the fact that so many Black soldiers died in the company of people who knew them and were buried without a marked grave, which was really the thing that all soldiers demanded, was that their death be known and honored. So this is yet another example of how race operated during the war to the great disadvantage, not only of Black soldiers, but their widows and their mothers and their children who found it difficult to document their deaths.
Well, and I was going to speak to too the through line that you talk about, because in slavery we know that slave bodies were never, they could be sold to medical schools, and a lot of them were used to further internal medicine, and autopsies were done on them. And sometimes they were sold by a slave master, and other times they were stolen by people who were grave robbers. And the fact that that continued in the North with a group of people who thought that were fighting to stop practices like that, and then just have that horror kind of reappear is devastating, I think, in the historical record.
It is. It is. And it was well known that this was occurring during the war. Yeah, and in interesting ways that it can be documented. But yes, it continues quite a bit. And the example that I offer in the book is in Washington, D.C. Again, for our listeners, Washington, D.C. actually ends slavery in April of 1862 because it's under the purview of Congress, right? Congress could act, and they decide in kind of a symbolic way to end slavery in the U.S. Capitol during the war. And as you know, there's a lot of battles in close proximity to Washington, D.C. So the result is we see large numbers of formerly enslaved people coming into the city because slavery's been ended there, because they have to escape warfare, and as a kind of a refuge where other Black people were gathering. And so the city's Black population greatly increases during the war, and it's a very vulnerable population. These are people who have survived slavery. They have survived the journey to Washington, D.C. They are working in the hardest, most difficult labor. There's I don't know, 70 fortresses around the city, and they all had to be built and maintained, and a lot of that was Black labor. And so this was a population that was ill, that was injured, and died at great rates in ways that the city was not prepared to even deal with. Cemeteries were segregated. There was very little actual cemetery space for African Americans to be buried in. And so one of the things I find is the challenges that municipal authorities faced in disposing of Black bodies, and the kind of disdain that attended that, and the fact that we cannot trace where those people were buried because out of necessity or disregard, military and municipal authorities saw no need to ensure that these people, who oftentimes they knew their names because friends and family members reported these deaths, and they were buried in unmarked graves and mass graves, etc. So, Washington is a particular example of that. I'm sure someone else could do research on the various cities where African Americans came to during the war, or the contraband camps, or the army camps, and find a similar pattern.
Right. And just before we kind of wrap up here, I do want to shift gears a little bit, because another character from American history pops up in this last chapter, and that's Minor and Night Hospital. And if anyone has read the Mad Men and the dictionary about the Oxford English, they're familiar with him. And I was very surprised to see him pop up in this story. So could you speak a little bit about how how he shows up and
Yeah. So again, like you say, he's best known as the largest contributor to the Oxford English Dictionary, which he was able to do because he was imprisoned in an insane asylum for his end of his life because he murdered someone and was judged to be insane. But during the war, he was a medical officer, and he had various stations. He was in Washington, D.C. for a while. He was also at Knight Hospital in New Haven, what became, Yale University's medical school and hospital. And Connecticut did raise some black regiments. So some black regiments would have, black soldiers would have been seen at that hospital. But Knight took it upon himself to conduct a series of postmortem examinations. And it's quite curious that the vast majority of bodies he did dissections of were black soldiers who had died in the hospital, and in numbers that were quite disproportionate to the actual patient ratio of white and black soldiers who were in the hospital. So he took it upon himself to conduct these examinations, and he paid unusual attention to the genitalia of the cadavers he examined. And yeah, it was unusual. And he's one of the few people I actually found who uh, invested Black embodiment in genitals as well as in other parts of the human anatomy. But he published his findings, his reports of his postmortems, and to me, this is one of many examples of Army medical officers who saw the war as an opportunity to build up their authority as race scientists. And this is a part of his life that has gone unmentioned by other scholars who have written about him.
well, I found it fascinating just because of who he was, but also because it does add that element that was so prevalent in the South of that sexual fear and that like retribution of, what obviously enslavers were doing to the slave population coming back on them tenfold.
That's right. That's right.
So I'd love for you to, because I think you did an excellent job in the book of showing exactly what you're talking about, how white authority was gained through the examination of these black bodies and cadavers, and through the war, you became not only a renowned doctor, but also a race doctor, and you could, go out and then help, be an authority on that. And then how that also then ties into the larger project of white supremacy in the North. So in your last chapter, you do offer some kind of like, you tie up some loose ends. So I'd love for you to do the same here. And just, I know it doesn't lead directly to the present, but there are some through lines that continue through past this.
Yeah, there are several. So one of those through lines is that at the very time in the Civil War era where medicine was becoming professionalized, where medical researchers and physicians were kind of policing the borders of who was an authentic and skilled physician and who was not, these ideas about race were central to that process. In other words, as people believed that being a professional meant publishing medical literature or pamphlets, many of those published during the war were about race, right? So ideas about racial hierarchies were kind of baked into the process of professionalizing medicine to the point that it reinforces, of course, what happens in medical colleges. It reinforces the exploitation and abuse of Black cadavers in medical schools. It reinforces the publication of racist medical literature. And that literature has a long life. It lives on in the work of 20th century scientific and medical investigators who call on that literature as justifying and rationalizing medical and scientific racism. The Sanitary Commission's collection of data, the provost marshal's questionnaires with the enlistment officers, that literature is cited in articles and books published in the 20th century. And, one great example of resistance to that race science is Du Bois, who devotes part of his early career to a refutation of exactly that trend in medical and scientific research. He did this excellent study of Philadelphia. So the literature itself has a long history into the 20th century. The military practice of using not just Black soldiers, but soldiers of color, whether they are Puerto Rican or of Mexican descent or Native American or Asian American, those soldiers become used in medical experimentation as though to prove that things like mustard gas affect soldiers of color differently, but also because soldiers of color are more expendable, right? So that use of the sort of non-consensual subject in the context of warfare in the military continues into World War I and World War II. The measurement of bodies and of skulls continues into the 20th century. And the measurement of bodies continues not just in the military, but in American colleges and universities. Students are measured to add to that data. And the development of something called race correction in testing and diagnosis, which we see having some of its origins in wartime medicine, continues today. The great medical historian Lundy Brown demonstrated for us that even today, the spirometer, which is a tool to measure lung capacity, even today in analyzing results, physicians use what they call race correction, which is, this long-lived notion, again, that Black bodies are inherently different and inferior. And race correction is used in a whole network of medical testing and analysis today. And we owe Lundy Braun a great recognition for demonstrating this before her recent passing. But it's, and of course, today we see people of African descent are treated poorly, their pain is mistreated, they are less likely to be diagnosed, and they enter into medical settings with suspicion because they have the experience of having been mistreated in medical settings. So this continues to have a vicious and vigorous life in American medicine and science.